Well, hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. We are going to talk about the history of the census and how genealogists use it. We were scheduled to do this program earlier this month, but due to the social distancing guidelines and the coronavirus, we are going to do this digitally. So I hope all of you that signed up for the program are able to view this. If not, we are going to archive it on the library's YouTube page. And so let me introduce myself. My name is Maggie Rose. I work for the Adult Learning and Information Services for the Twinsburg Public Library, and I would have been teaching this class in person. And even though I miss seeing your faces, I'm still really excited to bring you this content. It's going to be really good. There's a lot of excellent information in here on how census information is collected, on what it's used for, how researchers can access past census data, and how we can use it to find clues for our family history. So we're going to talk about the history and the access, the history of the census and how to access the data. We're going to talk about the type of data that is included in census records, and then we're going to touch on other types of census records. One of my most popular questions is, how do I do European census research? And that's a really tricky one to answer because censuses are unique to each individual country. And so I will touch a little bit on that coming up towards the end of this program. So as far as the history and historical importance of the census goes, the US first began conducting censuses in the year 1790. And they've done this every single 10 years ever since. It's quite an accomplishment, and it's really something to be proud of, that when this country puts their head to accomplish a task, we can do it. Some of the data that has been collected over the years has been the ages, the names, the sex, the address, and sometimes a lot more about an individual. All of this data is protected by a 72 restriction to protect privacy. And that's according to Title 44 of the US Code. And this was according to legislation that passed in 1978. So no one can access this data before that 72 restriction is up. Now, why do we have a census? Why do we need it? Well, we need it for tax purposes. In the beginning, Thomas Jefferson said that he wanted, excuse me, a more detailed view of the inhabitants of the country that he lives in. And so he said, let's do a census and ask some questions. They want to know how many people live in a certain area. They want to make sure that areas are getting taxed. Taxes was a big thing for the founding of this country. Remember the whole no taxation without representation deal? So they want to make sure that everyone is represented accurately in the government. And the census helps collect all this information. Now, when I mentioned the 72-year restriction, that is very, very strict. The Census Bureau can only release details from censuses that were collected before that 72-year restriction is up to the people named in that record, their heirs, or their legal representatives. By law, census information is confidential, and it's only used for statistical purposes, and it's exempt from the Freedom of Information Act and from the Privacy Act. And so I want you to know, you can't find it. You can't go and look up anyone else's, even if it's your relative. You can't find out their information unless that 72-year restriction is up. The next time we're going to see new census information is in April of 2020, where we will have access to research the 1950 census records. So when I say that they only use this information for statistical purposes, it's because they do these reports or publications. In 2010, they did a summary of population and housing characteristics of the people in the United States. And so what they did was they looked at, how many people, how many males between this age range live in this area? How many people of the Hispanic population live in this area? And they used this information for the appointment of our congressional leaders. They wanted to find out what what the population of America looks like as far as aging. What's the percentage of our older population? What's the percentage of American and Alaska Native population and our Asian population? They wanted to find all of these things out for statistical purposes, which generally means funding. How do we fund these things? Is there enough data there to fund them? And so when we want to research more about census records, one of my favorite resources was Measuring America, the Decennial Census from 1790 to 2000. And this was published by the US Bureau in the year 2002. This is 140 some page, maybe 150 page PDF document that you can access. I have the link here. Anyone can access this. Anyone can download this. If you are a serious census researcher, I recommend this resource. I can't recommend it enough. I recommend downloading it as a PDF so that you can do the Control F, the find function, so that instead of flipping through the book, you can just do it on your computer. It's also green, save paper, don't print it because it's a big publication. Keep it on your computer for when you are researching your family history through the census. The Fact Finder for the Nation, this is a nice little handout. This talks about the availability of census records about individuals. And this is, you know, I directly quoted this resource when I talked about the 72-year restriction. Another great resource is Mastering Census and Military Records by Daniel Quillen. I love this little book. It's almost pocket size. It's very much a handbook. I like to keep it right there next to my desk when I'm doing my research so I can easily flip through it. It has a lot of the same information that the Measuring America resource has in it, but it's easier to use and more people friendly. I'll say that. This, I have another little great article here, Who Talked to the Census Taker? And this is from the National Genealogical Society News Magazine. This is freely available on the internet. You can look it up and read this, but it talks about, you know, who was the person that was actually answering the questions back in the early censuses, and what kind of people were the people that were asking the census questions? And well, we'll get more into that later. So when we're using our census records for research, some things that we really need to be aware of are listed here. So consider, is the information that you are reading from the census, is that a primary source? Is it a secondary source? Is it third-hand information? So the enumerators or the census takers, they were actual real people. And in the early censuses, they were actually U.S. Marshals. So U.S. Marshals are appointed and they're around for a little while, and then in 1790, the government says, oh hey, and this falls into the and other duties as assigned, you're gonna go around in your community and ask people personal questions. And this could cause trouble if the U.S. Marshal for a certain area did not get along with a certain family. Think Hatfields and McCoys. If your arch enemy walked up, knocked on your door and said, hey, how many daughters you got? You might not really appreciate that question. So think about, you know, how this information is being disseminated. So sometimes if the U.S. Marshals couldn't get answers from the families themselves, they would instead ask their neighbors, or sometimes they would go down to the local watering hole and buy someone a pint and say, you know, tell me about that Smith house over there. How many people live there? How many slaves do they got? Do they have any servants? A lot of times in the very early census records, they're pretty accurate, but you have to be aware of sometimes when you're doing this research that you will find slaves or servants counted as family members, and you will find cousins counted as siblings, and then you will also find name abbreviations. In the very early censuses, the poor U.S. Marshals had to supply themselves with paper and ink. Now, it's not as easy as it is for us to just go down to the drugstore and get a pack of paper. It's real cheap. Paper was a valuable commodity, so was ink. Back, you know, in the 1700s, 1790s, 1800s. And they were kind of just, the US Marshals were sent out into the world and said, collect all this information, do it the best way you can. So a lot of times they did name abbreviations to save space on their paper and to save ink. And so you'll find I have a link here. This is a list of very common first name abbreviations. Chaz is short for Charles. C-O-N-S, Cons is short for Constance. And these were popular names during the day. And they're older names, you know, now. We don't see them a whole lot. But having a reference for name abbreviations is incredibly handy when you are using older census records. Be aware of alternate name spellings. If the enumerator, you know, wasn't as literate as most people would think, or maybe he had bought too many pints for his neighbors to gather their information in the early days. Excuse me again. You may find that some name spellings are different. For example, you know, Rose, my last name is Rose. Some people hear it as Rhodes, and that's R-H-O-D-E-S instead of Rose like the flower. So be aware, you know, think phonetically. Spell it out how you hear it, and you might strike gold during your research. Now, the 1890 census was mostly destroyed, and I'll talk more about that later. When you are viewing census records, it's really important to look at the original record. And you want to look at the original record because when you just look it up in a database, it has been transcribed by someone who has interpreted the original information contained in that resource to a text searchable database. So there are going to be, you will find, I promise, discrepancies between what the database says and what the original record shows. And so there will always be just a few slight discrepancies when it comes to who gave the census taker the information. Was it correct? Is everything spelled correctly? Did the census taker write it down correctly? And then the census takers, the US Marshals, had to provide two copies to the government. And they had to do this on their own paper with their own ink. And maybe they hired, you know, this guy down at the end of the bar to copy down all this information. Maybe he didn't copy it down right. And depending on which record was used to input this information into the database, there could be a lot of discrepancies. So it's really important that you always view the original record. You want to pay attention to the dates of enumeration. The census was taken during various times over the course of the century, or over the course of the census being taken. And I will talk more about when the census began, because it's very important. If your relative was born before the census was taken during a census year or after, did they exist or did they not exist? It's that simple. Were they married before or after the census was taken? Because that's going to play into your research quite a bit. Also, the order of visitation. So we like to think alphabetically, especially, you know, in libraries. Everything's alphabetical order by author's last name. In school, a lot of times we're seated alphabetical order by our last name. Well, the enumerators, the marshals, they didn't care what order they got the information in. They just got the information. If they knocked on house A and no one was there, they moved on to house B and then house C. And then once they were done with that street, they might go all the way back up to house A and see if anyone's home yet. And then if house A didn't answer again, they might stop by house B again to get the information for house A. So the order of visitation is not necessarily the geographic location or an alphabetical you know, notation of everyone who lived in a certain area. It's just that's the order in which the enumerator or the U.S. Marshal got in touch with them. When viewing the original records, you also want to note the handwriting. There are resources out there for helping you decipher handwriting, and I have a really good one I'm going to talk more about towards the end of the program. I keep giving you all these tidbits and say keep listening to the end of the program, because that's where you're going to get the good information. So I hope it's not too boring, and I hope you stick around for it. Also note the politics. In my family's census records, we are generally noted as being white folks. And however, when we get to a certain point, one of my ancestors is listed as being Black, which was surprising to us. But it could have been that the politics of the person who was taking that census said, well, this guy has red skin, he's not white, so he must be Black. Because those were the only two options there. So you have to pay attention to the current politics at the time that these censuses were taken, because you never know, you might find something interesting and you might have to interpret it. And so here is a great resource. I recommend using this. I've got the link to it right here. In some censuses, they want to record each individual person, and they say, okay, you live here, this is your name, this is your sex, this is your age. Well, how are you related to the head of household? Because they kind of want to know everyone's position. And this is super helpful for genealogical research, because we want to know, like, is this person a daughter? Is this person a niece? Is it a great grandmother? How is this person related to the person that we are researching? It can give us a lot of tips. Also, we want to know, a lot of times they asked people, what do you do for a living? And well, a lot of times they abbreviated that because it was a common question. So you'll find abbreviations for common careers or jobs, and you'll find abbreviations for relations to head of household. And this is a list of some of those. I highly recommend it. When you are researching these censuses, you can find out quite a bit of information about your ancestors. And so if you are super, super interested in learning more about census records, I recommend these sites. The National Archives has all kinds of information about census records, how to read them, how to access them. It has blank census sheets, and it's a valuable resource. I recommend checking that out as you delve into your census research. There's a YouTube video if you are a video learner. There's a nice little video about how to read censuses. It's not that long. I've got the link here. I recommend it. Excuse me. Excuse me again. So blank census forms are really handy to have. Blank census forms are handy because, like I said, in the early days, the enumerators had to create their own with their own ink and on their own paper. And so knowing what the columns are supposed to indicate is very important, because they're not always noted on the original censuses. And then one of my favorite resources is the Census Quick Start. This is from FamilySearch.org. They are a wonderful learning agency for researching censuses, and it has great strategies for getting up and going with your genealogical research. Jill Shoemaker from the Riverton Family Search Library, this is kind of a snapshot of what she says, and it may be kind of redundant, we may have already gone over this, but these are the most important things. When you are searching for a family member, only search for them one census year at a time. And this is important because there's somebody out there with your family member's exact name. And there's probably someone out there with your family member's exact name in the exact same state, in the same county, and possibly even in the same city. So to keep your results, your search results manageable, you want to search only 1 year at a time. And then also try those name variants. You know, I used my name as an example. I have it here again. Funny story, true story. When we call to order pizza, we never know what name they're going to give us. You know, we say we'd like to place a pickup order for Rose. And sometimes the little label on our pizza box says Rhodes or Ruse even. And that's because it's that translation between one person to another. Remember that old game telephone? Well, things can get muddled during the transmission of information. Also, I haven't mentioned this before, but you need to know when to use married versus maiden names. It's really important to learn the maiden names of your female ancestors if you are researching that line, because they change. And sometimes they change more than once. It's not unheard of for a woman to change names from her maiden name to her first married name to her second married name. And sometimes they'll change a few times in between censuses. So keeping track of that is really important, and then remembering to switch to the maiden name when you go back to that next oldest census record when you are searching for your female ancestors. And then again, you always want to look at the original record, and you also want to make sure to check the date of the enumeration to confirm birthdays and marriage years. And so now what I want to do is I want to go through and I want to talk about what each individual census was like, given the information that we have from Measuring America, the decennial censuses. This is kind of like a summary of that resource. And I'm going to try to move quickly through this because it can be a little redundant. So in the 1790 census, it was very basic. They wanted to know how many people are over 16, how many people are under 16, how many of those people are men, how many are women, and what is the head of household name. Unfortunately, the War of 1812 destroyed many of the original census records, but you can still access some of them from Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Virginia. Now, they didn't start taking down this information until August 12th. And they also counted the number of slaves and the number of servants and tenants. But the only name that they recorded was the head of household name. So if you are searching for someone who was not head of the household in 1790, it's going to be pretty difficult to find their name in that very first census. In the 1810 census, they began a little earlier in the year, on the first day of August, and it also recorded similar information, but it broke down the ages into smaller brackets. And it allowed enumerators or census takers or the U.S. Marshals to make remarks. And then some of these records have been reconstructed, and I'll talk more about what a reconstructed record is. It's really exciting stuff, and maybe one day I'll get that job. So here are examples of the 1790 federal census from New Hampshire and Rhode Island. And so you can see that someone wrote the page numbers in wax pencil, which was great because that's really interesting. And the enumerator on the left was very particular. He had a wonderful handwriting. He labeled all of his columns and he carried things over from the previous page. The enumerator on the right only labeled columns on the right-hand page and then carried that information over, carried the columns over after he would turn the page in his book to the left. So this is an example of how different U.S. Marshals recorded things differently and why it's important to view the original and to have those blank census records, because we can't really read what the columns are supposed to indicate. But there's definitely information here, definitely worthwhile. For the 1810 federal census, again, they're kind of tricky to read. The North Carolina census over here on the right doesn't even have any headings on the columns. It's just really important to have those blank census forms so that we know, what does this 2 mean? What does this 1 mean? That kind of thing. And then the census on the left here is a little neater, but it's still incredibly difficult to read. So which is why it's important to have those blank censuses. So for the 1820 federal census, so that began on the first Monday of August, and that was because I believe that year the first day of August fell on a Sunday. We don't work on Sundays in 1820. And the questions were the same as before, with the additions of some more details. And then you can see here in the columns, we have free white males, free white females, and then slaves. And then it's male slaves and female slaves. And then free colored people. And so those are that's the language that they used during this 1820 federal census. And so you need to be aware of the politics as you're going through here to understand what that meant. They also asked about foreigners who were not naturalized, that would be immigrants. They also wanted to know, do you participate in agriculture, commerce, or are you a manufacturer? And so this was the kind of information that the government was interested in 1820. So for the 1830, 1840 federal censuses, they each began on June 1st. Do you see a trend here? We're starting earlier and earlier every year, which is interesting to note because our country is growing at this time. Our cities are getting bigger. Our rural areas are filling up with population. And so they started the census on June 1st. And the 1830 census was the first use of printed census schedules. I think the census, the government finally said, hey, wait a second. We need we need to be able to read all this information. Why don't we print up the schedules and send them out to the U.S. Marshals to collect this? And so it's just so refreshing to see it nice and neat and in print. However, it's still tricky to read those names, so learning about handwriting in 19th century America is still pretty important. These censuses, they didn't ask about manufacturing or commerce, but they did ask about foreigners and white or black people who were deaf or blind. This was something that was really of interest back then. This was part of knowing the politics of the time. They wanted to know, who was deaf, who was blind, and, they wanted that statistic to try to figure out what resources that population needed. They included more detailed age ranges, and then the 1840 required enumerators to provide 2 copies. So this is what I'm talking about when the U.S. Marshals said to the guy down the bar, hey, copy this for me and we can send it in. Schedules were introduced in 1840. The schedules are special questions that only related to certain people. And if you answered yes to one of the special schedules, then the enumerator had additional questions for you. If you can find your ancestors in the schedules, you have more information than people who are not found in the schedules. And I'll talk more about schedules in a moment. So for the 1850 and 1860 federal census, again, this begins on June 1st. And this was the year that they established the Census Board. They went this many years without a census board. The Census Board was made up of the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the Postmaster General. And they printed out the forms and the schedules. And the Department of the Interior was also formed during this time period to supervise the work of the U.S. Marshals. So if we think about it, the work of the U.S. Marshals was unsupervised before this time, which is why I'm saying, yeah, think about, if this wasn't created before then, what was in place to maintain things? So it's interesting to note. Some of the questions they asked are, they're starting to get pretty standard questions now. Names, age, sex, race, occupation, do you own real estate, that kind of thing. And you can see in this census record that I have over here that this is starting to be more familiar to people who research census records. This is a pretty common sight. Starting to get more standardized. The 1870 federal census also began on June 1st, but there was a stricter submission deadline for marshals. And like I said, if you lived in a family and you were feuding against the family that your local marshal was from, you may not want to answer the questions. So they had to institute a penalty for refusing to answer census questions. And some of the schedules included the general population schedule. That's the census that we are most familiar with. That's the example that I have on the screen here. But if you had anyone pass away in your family, then the U.S. Marshal would collect the information on a mortality schedule. If you participated in agriculture, the U.S. Marshal would collect that information on the agricultural schedule. And there was a products of industry schedule and a social statistics schedule. And so the marshals had a lot of work to do, and they only had to do it every 10 years. And so a lot of this was probably a bit much for them. So we got to give them credit. And so beginning on June 1st, the 1880 federal census, there was a new law in effect in the Census Act of 1879. So in 1879, census records were not confidential, which would probably explain why some people didn't want to answer those questions. But they have been supposedly confidential since 1879. And the U.S. Marshals were relieved of their duties, and specially appointed agents, including supervisors and enumerators, they were either assigned or appointed. And the information collected was similar, but it had more details, and it included the same schedules as before. And this year, enumerators are required by law to visit each dwelling. So the fact that they had to put this stuff in writing to make it a law tells me that this was a reactive law, not a proactive law. So the U.S. Marshals were not visiting every dwelling, and people were not being really confidential with the information they were collecting about families, and people were not answering the Marshals' questions. So they had to switch things up again a bit to get the accurate data that they wanted. The 1890 federal census is a heartbreak for many genealogy researchers. So it started on June 2nd. June 1st was a Sunday, and they used new technology to collect information. They had 175 census supervisors across the states and territories, and the supervisors made sure that the enumerators visited each family, and that the enumerators visited, a group of enumerators had 1 week to visit each city that had a population under 10,000, which is not a lot of time. It was really an accomplishment. And a lot of these records were destroyed by fire, nearly all of them. There was a special schedule this year that denoted surviving soldiers, sailors, and Marines and widows of the War of the Rebellion. And the new technology is pretty cool. It's Herman Holrith. I have a link here. He invented a counting machine, like a tabulating counting machine for the 1890 federal census. And so thankfully, the information, the statistics were compiled before the 1890 federal census was first damaged by fire, destroyed by water, damaged by fire, destroyed by water, and then finally absolutely positively destroyed. It is just heartbreaking to think about what happened. And if PBS would love to do like one of those forensic files whodunit episodes about what happened to the 1890 census schedules, I would definitely be interested in seeing that. In 1896, fire damaged the special schedules, and then they were further damaged by the water used to put the fire out. And so in 1921, the population schedules were destroyed by fire and then further damaged by the water used to put them out. And so any remaining 1890 census records were destroyed by the Commerce Department in 1935 because they were old and moldy. And ironically enough, the National Archives building, the cornerstone was laid for that in 1935 as well. So we didn't have a National Archives building until 1935. And so these censuses were just being stored in repositories. And in the case of the 1921 fire, instead of being inside a supposedly fireproof vault, they were stacked right outside the door. So bad luck for 1890 census record genealogist researchers. For more information on the fire, if you have a conspiracy theory kind of mind, or if not, if you're just interested in fun American census facts, I recommend the article First in the Path of the Fireman, and that you can access that through the National Archives. Holes in History, this is from Family Tree Magazine. I love Family Tree Magazine. They're a hoot, wonderful resource for family researchers. And then the website Random Acts of Genealogical Kindness, they have a nice little article about the 1890 census records being destroyed. So if you would like more information about the fire, I would definitely visit those resources. For the 1900-1910 federal census, it began on June 1st in 1900, but 10 years later, they had to move it up a month and a half to April 15th because they just weren't able to get things done. They were trying to, count cities of less than 8,000 people in only 2 weeks. Rural areas were given 1 month for every family to be visited and counted. They had 297 supervisors, and they had 52,726 enumeration districts. This is how much our country has grown. It's interesting to see what they had to do, how many people were involved to collect this information every 10 years. It just blossoms. And there were special enumerations of Indian territories, prisons, military branches, hospitals, and other special institutions like sanitariums. And so we still have these special enumerations today. This year, group living situations such as military, prisons, and other institutions, they have a special schedule, a special way to be counted. On the 1920 federal census, this is the most unusual one. Even though the enumerators went out into the world on April 1st, which was no joke, they asked people the question, tell me, where did you sleep on the night of January 1st? And so the enumerators asked people where they slept on that night, and then that is where that person was counted. If they moved in between January 1st and April 1st, then they were counted in their previous abode. It is completely unclear why the government decided to do this, but if you find your family member in a 1920 federal census that says they lived in, place A, and you try to confirm that, it may be that they moved in between the time that the census was taken and January 1st. The 1930 federal census again began April 1st, and some of the special schedules include agriculture, manufacturing, distribution, construction, unemployment, and this time they used punch cards to tabulate all of the information. And this again goes back to Herman Holrith, who first instituted this technology. The 1940 federal census began on April 1st, and it was a census of housing and included sampling as well. And so when we talk about the censuses, The next census we're going to have access to is the 1950 federal census, and that's going to be available to us in 2 years, in April 1st, 2020. Until then, if you want to access any of the information included in the censuses, your choices are Ancestry.com, which you can access freely with your library card. The good people at Ancestry have allowed people in the state of Ohio with I possibly other places, I'm just not sure about it, unconfirmed, but I know for sure in the state of Ohio, if you have a library card, you can access Ancestry for free through your library's website. There is no account required for this beside your library card account. Additionally, you cannot create an account with the library edition of Ancestry.com, but what you can do is access all of their census records, and you can print them and you can use their database, and it's a wonderful resource. If you don't have access to Ancestry Library Edition or Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org has the exact same information as Ancestry.com. You can access this with any internet connection. You do have to create an account. It is required that you create an account with them, and you need an email address to do this. And again, you can print the original records and add them to your research log. So talking a little bit more about schedules. So they varied each year. I have a picture here of the slave schedules, and this was from the 1800 federal census. And so what they wanted to know is the head of household's name, and then the number of slaves and the ages and their sex. And so if you can find your family members in these schedules, you're getting additional information about them, and good for you. And so these schedules were used to collect additional data. So when you are searching censuses, don't forget to also go with the special schedules. It's going to be a different search term, and it's going to say, schedules. And yes, you want to look at the schedules because that is where you're going to find all the details. So the schedules varied, but kind of a breakdown. You can find slave schedules in 1850 and 60, the mortality schedules in 1850 through 1880. There was an interim census taken in 1885 for Colorado, Florida, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and New Mexico. You can find Indian schedules, their term, not mine, in 1885 through 1940. And veteran schedules, 1840 and 1890. Some of them, the veteran schedules, a few of them did survive the fire. You can find death schedules in 1880, defective dependent delinquent schedules in 1880 as well. And one thing to note is that the indexing for these schedules is incomplete. Not all of the information from these schedules has been inputted into databases. So when you're doing your Ancestry.com search or your FamilySearch.org search, a lot of this stuff is not gonna be text searchable in the database. It's not gonna show up. So what you have to do is you have to look at that original census record and find your enumeration district, and then browse through the schedules for that year and match up the enumeration district to see if your family member's in there. So earlier I mentioned reconstructed records. And so the 1890 census has not yet been reconstructed, but they're currently working on the 1800 and 1810 federal censuses because they didn't record the names of the people that actually lived there. They only recorded the head of household's name. And so what they have doing is they have researchers going back through time using land deeds, marriage records, baptismal records to place names to the other individuals in the house. And so this is where you are finding information for your ancestors in the very early censuses before they started recording names. Sampling's pretty fun as well. Sampling began in the 1940 census, And sampling said, okay, enumerators, whoever lands on line 14 and 29 gets asked all these extra questions. And the Census Bureau decided that this would account for 5% of the population, and that they can use the sample data for early reports instead of counting everyone, because by 1940, our population had grown so much. They wanted to get these reports out there, and they said, let's do this as effectively as we can. So we're going to do sampling. So these extra questions are really cool, because if you can find your relative in a sample, then there you go, you've got a lot more information. And again, these may not have been databased. You're going to have to cross-reference, print out those original census schedules, you know, the general population ones, and then try to match them up with the samples for that year. And you're going to do that by enumeration district. So states also took censuses, and so not every state did. Usually when a state took a census, they did it in the 5th year. So it would be 1885 or 1905. They did it, you know, in between the other censuses. And the information that each state collected varied. Not every state did it, and every state kind of did it their own way. And so you can access these the same way you would the federal censuses via Ancestry, Library Edition, and FamilySearch.org. And you can also access them via your state repositories. Either go online to see if your state has a repository, or you can write to them and ask them to send you photocopies. For European census records, again, this is really tricky. Each country did it their own way. You know, there's Ireland, there's the UK, there's name changes, there's France, there's border changes, there's language changes, and then there's naming conventions. So a schedule could be called something different in a different country. And so it really depends on the specific country that you are researching in to try to find that particular information. You can find some of these on FamilySearch.org and also on Ancestry Library Edition. Now here, they have lots of resources here. I have a link here for Ancestry Library Edition for European family history research. And so they do have some censuses here. Sometimes they're called registers. But this is going to be like your best starting research for European census records. For more information on European census records, you're going to go to Library of Congress, where you can find lots of information on international censuses. I have included the link here. You also can check the National Archives websites of each country. And then also there's a great book, it's a great article, Trace Your European Roots, and this is by David Frixell, and this is again from that Family Tree magazine that I like so much, and I've included the link here as well. Some of the resources that I said I was going to talk about, I have right here. The Handwriting of American Records for a Period of 300 Years. This was published in 1981. It is out of print. You can still interlibrary loan this resource. I highly recommend doing it. There are other books out there for learning how to read older handwriting, but I love E.K. Kirkham's book because she has specific charts per year on how things were likely written. And I find this to be the best, easiest resource to use. Again, I'm going to mention the Measuring America, the decennial censuses. And then also there's the all-in-one basic guide to genealogy and ancestry resource. I recommend getting your hands on this through your library as well. It's like having a mentor for your genealogical resource in a book. Very conversational tone, very informative, and Kimberly Berry will give you the pitfalls to certain research as well as things to, special things to look out for. And then again, the Daniel Quillen's Mastering Census and Military Records, that little handbook I mentioned earlier. I love that resource. If you can get your hands on that through your library. I also recommend maybe purchasing a used copy from Amazon.com because they're very, very affordable. So if you have any questions or if you have any tips, tricks, or ideas that you would like to share, feel free to do so in the comments. We do monitor these feeds and we will get back to you. A more direct way to do it would be to just email me directly at mrose@twinsburglibrary.org. I would love to hear from you. I love feedback. I want to hear your ideas. And if you get stuck during your family research, I'd love to help you out as well. And I want to say thank you to everyone for coming. The lovely woman on the left of your screen here is my grandmother. This is the picture that she sent to my grandfather when he was on board a ship during World War II. They fell in love over letters and pictures. And so this is a nod to my family history. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it, and everyone have a great day and stay healthy out there.